Okay, excellent. I want to do two small things that are unrelated because Parshat Yitro is about two independent things. One of them is Yitro's arrival at Har Sinai and his interaction with Moshe Rabbeinu. And the second thing, of course, is Matan Torah. So I'm going to start with Matan Torah. And time permitting, we'll go back and take another look at Yitro. There's an interesting midrash, which is not a midrash. So let's clarify terms. When I use the word midrash, what do I mean? What is a formal definition of a midrash? Anybody? I just ran in, so I'm going to take a couple minutes to breathe. I'm asking you guys questions. What is a formal definition?
A close reading of the text based on taking apart the words, similarities in words.
Okay, thank you, Debbie. That the critical word you used was my favorite four-letter word. Now I teach high school, so I hear a lot of them, right? My favorite four-letter word is text. Text. That a midrash is always around a text. By the way, not always a biblical text. We find in the Mishnah and in the Tosefta that there are Chachamim who make drashot from the language of Chachamim, from the language of the Ketubah, and the language of Ishtar. But typically, a midrash is a reading of the text of Tanakh and turning it into something more than meets the eye. Correct. And here we have a drasha, which is not a midrash. And we're going to start off with this. There was a particular Galilean who came to visit Bavel, and he came to Rav Chista's Beit Midrash outside of Surah, and he gave the following homily, which is not about a pasuk. Brich Rachmana, and it's all in Aramaic. Yahav Uriant Litai, and you can see I highlighted the word Litai here. And Litai means threefold. A little hint for you: whenever you see a tav in Aramaic, think shin. Think shin. All right, because you have to remember that Aramaic has more consonants than Hebrew, and as Aramaic comes into Hebrew, because Aramaic predates Hebrew, as Aramaic comes into Hebrew, some of the consonants are joined. And so, for instance, there are three different consonants that become a tzadi. So there's tzadi represents three different letters. There's shin represents two different letters, shin and a tav, a certain kind of tav, a thav. And so tlitai, uriant tlitai means Brich Achmana, blessed is God. Diyav uriant tlitai, who gave a threefold light or Torah, and it's referring to Torah Nevi'im Ktuvim, a division which already existed in the time of Rav Chista, as back before him. La'am tlitoi, to a nation that is a threefold nation. What does that mean?
Kohen.
Yes, just look at your matzahs, Kohen Levi Yisrael, right? Al yedei tlitoi, through the agency of a third. Who's that? Moshe Rabbeinu, who's the third child in the family, as far as we know. Biyom tlitoi. Now, this is the one I want to focus on, because some of these are, to be honest with you, serendipitous. Meaning that this Darshan wanted to highlight something about the number 3, and that's because 2 of the items on this list were deliberate, and they were the focus of his drasha. And then he grabbed every of the 3 he could to build a beautiful little image. The fact that Moshe is third from the womb, and the fact that Am Yisrael is a threefold nation, which is irrelevant at Matan Torah, because at Matan Torah it's only 2, Kohanim and the rest of everybody else. The fact that it's Tanakh is totally irrelevant at this time because the Nach part isn't happening. But the last 2 are critical. Biyom Tlitoi, on the 3rd day, Biyarchat Tlitoi, in the 3rd month. So let's remember that the Torah was given in the 3rd month, and we do not know what date it was given on, meaning there's nothing in the Torah that says what date it was given on. We're told that in the 3rd month, Bayom Hazeh Ba'u Midbar Sinai. So if Bayom Hazeh is, as Chazal claim, Rosh Chodesh, which it could be, but not necessarily, we still don't have an accurate chronology of from that moment until Matan Torah, how many days it is, which is why there's a machloket, Rabbi Yossi and Rabbanan, if the Torah was given on the 6th or the 7th. Now, by the way, when I say the Torah was given, that's quite obscure. What do I mean? Do I mean that Hashem said the Aseret HaDibrot? Does it mean that Moshe went up to Har Sinai and came down with the Dibrot, which was much later in the summer? What does it mean? So for right now, for working in definition, we'll say Matan Torah means Hashem speaking the Aseret HaDibrot. And that there's a machloket, was the 6th of Sivan or 7th of Sivan. So why does he say the third day? Third month I get. It happened in the third month. Why does he say the third day? Because as we will discover when we look at the story of Matan Torah, the narrative of Matan Torah, when after Moshe and went back and forth between Hashem and the Am as the Shadchan, he was really operating as a Shadchan. They want to go out. You want to go out. What kind of house are you going to build, etc. He's the Shadchan. After all that happened, Hashem said to Moshe, tell Bnei Yisrael to prepare for 3 days. And in the third day, I'm going to come down on the mountain, and indeed on the third day. And there's an emphasis in the text on the third days. You'll see, if you already got the text, you'll see it. Otherwise, when we scroll down, you'll see an emphasis on the text on the third day. But why is the third day a big deal? Now, the third day isn't just a big deal in the mouth of this darshan. It's also a big deal in the Torah, because the Torah repeats, why is that such a big deal? From there, we're going to leapfrog to why the third month is a big deal. All right. So now we're going to do a journey, which is a backwards journey. Normally, when I teach, I'll teach Psukim, I'll teach Parshiot, and then we'll take a look at Midrash. We'll take a look at Midrash Halacha and Midrash Haggadah, and we'll look at Rishonim. We're doing it backwards. We're going to start with Midrash and go to Psukim, which is pedagogically wrong. But for purposes of this year, it's right. There is a Midrash in Breshit Rabbah, and this is a Midrash Agadah on the Pasuk, right? And the Pasuk is by Yom HaShlishi. It is the first time, besides the third day of creation, that Yom Shlishi is mentioned. And it is at the Akedah. Avraham leaves for the Akedah. He goes on the journey with Yitzchak and the 2 other kids and the donkey and the wood and the fire, etc., and not the lamb. And by Yom HaShlishi, Avraham looks up and he sees the place from a distance. And at that point, he says to the boys, you stay here with the donkey, famous drasha. I and the boy are going to come and we will return, famous problem. By Yom HaShlishi, this is the Midrash. Now, this Midrash takes on the form of what we call a ptichta, which means a form of an introductory homily to the context. How do I know that? Because it starts not by discussing by Yom HaShlishi, but by quoting a pasuk from some other book of Tanakh. And that book is the book of Hosea. And in the book of Hosea, chapter 6, verse 2, we find the pasuk, Yechayenu miyomayim, by Yom HaShlishi yikimenu v'nichya lefanav. We could spend the entire hour, which we don't have, just translating this pasuk. It is a very confusing pasuk. I will give you what one of the common translations is. He will keep us alive for 2 days, and on the third day will raise us and we will live before him. Now, just as a side note, I was flabbergasted to find that this pasuk did not play a central role in Jewish-Christian polemic, because you would think that this pasuk would just be great for the Christians. He'll keep us alive for 2 days, and on the third day we will rise and stand before him. I mean, this is just Good Friday, Easter, all over the place. And indeed, it does not show up very much in polemic literature. It's not even mentioned in the Christian Bible. It's just alluded to in 1 Corinthians. But that's it. Interesting thing. But leave that alone, as we would like to do. And this pasuk is not speaking to the Akedah. This pasuk is saying something about Tchiat HaMetim, about a national revival, whatever it may be. And then, as you see in the Midrash, and I lined it up, the Midrash gives us a whole series of Bayom HaShlishis in Tanakh. It looks comprehensive. Don't let it fool you. It's not. There's a couple of Bayom HaShlishis that are left out. We'll talk about which ones are left out as we go along. Bayom HaShlishi Shel Shvatim. Now, by the way, notice we've left Avraham out. Because Avraham is sort of the founding place of this. So by Yom HaShlishi Shel Shvatim, the next time we think, it's not true, but the next time that we find Yom HaShlishi is when Yosef, Tahainu Safnat Paneach, the Egyptian viceroy, takes these 10 men and imprisons them for 3 days, saying, I'm going to imprison you and hold you hostage, and one of you can go back and get your younger brother. And on the third day, he lets them out of prison. He says, Zot asu v'chyu et Elohim ani yarei. Don't worry, I have a sense of morality. And he sends all of them back except one. So things get better. And that one is Shimon, and who knows if that's maybe not good for all of them to be separated from Shimon. In any case, so on the third day of the Shvatim, and they quote the Pasuk. What's going on? Bayom HaShlishi shel Matan Torah. And then they quote from our story. Vayhi Bayom HaShlishi biyot haboker, Vayhi Anan kaved al har, right? And there's smoke and there's fire, and Hashem comes down. Yom Shlishi. Biyom Shlishi shel Meraglim. Now, when you say Meraglim, most people think Meraglim is the 12 guys that Moshe sent. Problem is, they're not Meraglim. They're never called Meraglim. The actual Meraglim are the two men that Yoshua sent to spy out Yericho. And if you remember, Rachav dropped them out the window and told them to run not east back to the camp, because the posse was looking for them there, but to run west. And they ran. If you're familiar with Jericho, you know that over Jericho, there are a bunch of mountains. There are some Me'arota Maccabim. We found remnants of these are places where the Maccabim in their wars hid out. So 1,000 years earlier, 1,400 years earlier or so, or 1,200 years earlier, before the Maccabim, the two spies of Yehoshua went and ran and hid up there for 3 days. And on the third day, they then knew the posse was gone, and they came back to Yehoshua and they gave him the report. But Yom Shlishi shel Yonah. What's that? Well, Yonah got thrown in the water. A fish ate him. And what happened on the third day?
Spread them out.
Right. And we think that that's what this is about. I'll show you that it's not likely about that. It's about something else, but that's what it seems like. In other words, what we're getting a sense is that for 2 days, we're in trouble. And on the third day, the trouble is resolved. We're in prison for 2 days. And on the third day, most of us are let out. We're held in prison in this fish. And on the third day, we're let out. But that doesn't explain Matan Torah. It does not explain Avraham. And you're going to see that it will also not work for the rest. Due to time considerations, if you take a look at this midrash on your own, I'm going to stop it here because you'll notice we're going to skip to, but you'll notice that there is a famous Yom HaShlishi that's missing here, and that is the butler and the baker. If you recall, the butler and the baker had their dream, and Yosef's interpretation of the dream is, in 3 more days, Paro will recognize you. And indeed, it says on the third day, Yom Huledet Paro, which was probably not Paro's birthday. It was probably the anniversary of his coronation. The butler was recognized, the baker was recognized, and both of them ended up being raised up. One to a position, one to a gallows, but raised up. Not exactly a gallows. Okay, so that's left out. We have to figure out why that's left out. There's another Yom Shlishi that's left out, but it's not in the area of narrative. It's in the area of halacha. And I'll let you stew on it for a little while, but I'm going to suggest that it could actually fit in here quite well. But the one I really want to get to, because I asked Rabbi Kelman if he would prefer me to teach Yonah or Esther, because Purim's coming up. He said, Yitro or Esther. He said Yitro. I said, fine, but I'm going to sneak some Esther in anyways, which is, and I didn't do it, the Midrash did it. B'yom Shlishi shel Esther. All right, the third day of Esther. What's that? Esther told Mordechai, go get everybody together and fast for 3 days. And I'll fast also, and then I'll come to the king, and I'll risk my life, and maybe I'll be dead. But, kasher avadati avadati. And on the third day, she comes in. Parenthetically, if you want to have your minds blown, you haven't seen this yet, take a look at the Septuagint, that's the Greek translation of Tanakh, at the verse at the end of chapter 4 of Esther. The end of chapter 4 is a very short verse, which is, Vayavor Mordechai vayas k'chol asher tzivta alav Esther. Mordechai went and did what Esther told him. A very short verse. In the Septuagint, that verse takes up half a page. Read it in the Septuagint. You can read the translation in English. It will surprise you greatly. Right? In LA, we call that blow your mind. Okay. But b'yom shlishi shel Esther. What's that? Now, Esther puts on her royal garments, comes into the king, and praying, as you see in the Septuagint, praying that she will somehow not be killed and she'll have a chance to work her magic and get the king to rescind the decree or to discover Haman's treachery. Now, let's take a look what they do with this. What does it mean about Tabash Malchut? She put on the royalty of her paternal house, meaning the tradition was that Esther and Mordechai were both descendants of Shaul. So she assumed an air of royalty. But what schut did she have that allowed her to after 3 days of fasting, to walk in, or on the third day of fasting, to walk in with that kind of air and be able to impress the king so that he favored her and all went well, and we have Purim instead of not. So Rabbanan Amri b'schut Yom Shlishi shel Matan Torah. The Rabbanan say, you know what schut stood by Esther's side? The schut of the 3 days of Matan Torah, the third day of Matan Torah. Got to figure out what that is. Rabbi Levi Amar b'schut Yom Shlishi shel Avraham. So that's why this midrash looks like a poem, a ptichta. It starts out with a pasuk about Avraham. It goes to a pasuk in Hosea, winds its way around Tanakh, and ends up at our pasuk, which is by Yom HaShlishi Vayisa Avraham et Einav. The schut of the Akedah. What's going on here? What is this about? So I'd like to show you in Midrash Esther Rabbah. Now, by the way, Midrash Esther Rabbah is really two different collections. The first 6 parashot of Esther Rabbah come from around the 6th or so century. It's a relatively middle Midrash. But the rest of Esther Rabbah, the last 4 parashot, Vav through Yod, are much later, like 9th century. So you're looking at a late Midrash. This is Parshat, as you can see. That's something that's hard to look at straight up. Am Yisrael is never in trouble for more than 3 days. Okay. Shariba Avraham Tivan, they quote the pasuk about Avraham. Hashvatim, they quote the pasuk about the tribes, right? As if to say that Avraham on the 3rd day is relieved of his tzara. That's a little strange. Yonah, after 3 days, right? And the same thing with Esther, the miracle happened after 3 days. Okay, great. But, we've certainly seen in our own lifetimes, Am Yisrael in terrible trouble for way more than 3 days. Let's see what this midrash means. So I'm going to actually look at another later midrash, Midrash Tanchuma, which is going to start us on our path. The Midrash Tanchuma in Vayera, in the Akedah story, makes the following comment. Balama b'yom hashlishi. Why did Hashem only show Avraham Har HaMoriah on the 3rd day? Now, I got to throw in this parenthetic statement. As far as we're concerned, where is Har HaMoriah? Because, by the way, Eretz HaMoriah and one of the mountains in Eretz HaMoriah, which is where the Akedah is supposed to take place, is absolutely unparalleled. It's unprecedented and unmatched in Tanakh as a location until you get to the Second Temple period. The word Moriah doesn't show up again until Divrei Yamim. So where is Moriah? What's our tradition tell us?
Har HaBayit.
Har HaBayit. Of course we know it's Har HaBayit because as we see in Divrei Yamim Bet Perek Yamol, Shlomo starts to build Beit Hashem B'Har HaMoriah. Okay. The interesting thing is that there is a group in Israel, a very, very small group, that have a tradition. They are not Jewish, although they claim that they are the true Jews. A lot of people like to make that claim. And they're called the Shomronim. I don't know if any of you have been to Har Grizim. I've been there many times. It's a beautiful community, lovely people. I've been there for the Korban Pesach. I've been there in Sukkot. It's really a very, very nice community. And if you look in the Shomroni tradition, you'll find that they maintain that the Akedah happened on Har Grizim. Now, by the way, there's a certain logic to that, which is that if you go from Be'er-Sheva to Yerushalayim, it takes about a day. And I'm not talking about, I had a car like that also, that old joke about Israeli cars. I mean, going with a donkey, it would take about a long day, a day and a half. But to Shechem would take 3 days. And by the way, they, in their Torah, Har HaMoriah is spelled Har HaMora'ah. Now, do you know the other name for Shechem in the Torah? When we first meet the city of Shechem, it's called Elon
Morah.
Except in their Torah, it's Elon Morah. And so they identify, they say simply, Hashem told Avram, go back to the first place you came to, where he built the first Mizbeach, and bring Yitzchak. And Har Grizim is Har HaKadosh. Okay, just thought I'd throw that out. A lot of fun. Now, The Midrash here, of course, assuming that Har Moriah is Yerushalayim, says, so why didn't Hashem show him right away? Why delay him around for 3 days? Why not show him right away where it is? The Midrash is, it's so powerful, so deep. Watch this. Now, it's important to note that the Midrashim and the Rishonim and all the Mefarshim and Soren Kierkegaard and the Rav, everybody tries to figure out what is this Akedah about. Right? Fear and trembling, Kierkegaard. What is the Akedah about? Everybody's bothered by it. The Midrashim have, among their different approaches, one of their approaches is that the Akedah was done for the benefit of the nations of the world. Not benefit to help them, but to show them. To show them that God's choice of Abraham was a legitimate choice. That Abraham surpassed them in his loyalty and his bravery, so that he really earned the position of being the source of bracha. That's informing this midrash. Shelo yomru umot ha'olam, the nations should not say, because according to midrash, everybody's going to know about the Akedah, everybody's going to hear about it. Hamamov v'halach v'shachat ibno. God shocked him and he went and shachted his son. In other words, the notion is that Abraham is going to go and offer his son. And if he offers him on the first day, he starts walking, and 3 hours later, God says, there's the mountain, and he goes up, everybody's going to say, yeah, he was in shock. If he had his wits about him, he wouldn't listen to God, he wouldn't do it. In other words, for God to prove that Abraham is really doing this out of conviction and loyalty, and not out of shock, he shows it, he gives him 3 days to walk around until he shows him the mountain. What's going on? So this midrash is speaking to a very deep truth about psychology, about people and how we respond to things. We have all experienced I can't speak to anybody here personally, we've all experienced on a national level, on an international level, on a communal level, shocking news. I don't mean somebody who was sick for a long time and they finally passed away. I mean 9/11, right? I mean, I remember as a little kid, the assassination of John F. Kennedy. As a slightly older kid, the assassination of his brother and of Martin Luther King, 2 months apart from each other. These were shocking moments. Now, the reality is that when we get shocking news, and by the way, the shocking news does not have to be that. The shocking news can also be that the market just went up by 5,000 points and I'm suddenly can retire. The shocking news can be a good piece of news. Imagine how we felt. I was very, very young at the time, but imagine how we felt at the end of those 6 days. We were euphoric. I'm talking about June 67. When you get the shocking news for that first day, and by the way, it doesn't matter if that first day is 20 hours or 3 hours. It doesn't matter if you get the news in the morning or the evening. For that first day, the reality is you're in shock. And a smart person doesn't make any important decisions at that point, doesn't call people that he's got, to try to mend a relationship with. He knows that he's in shock. Hopefully it's a good shock. He wakes up, and the second day, he has time to think it over, to mull it over. What does it mean? Where do I put this in my life? How do I feel about these people who did this thing? I know, having lived through several riots here in LA, I know, having lived through several destructive earthquakes here in LA. Many of you have lived through terrible storms. The first day, you can't really think. You're just in shock. And the next day, you're starting to collect things around and start putting in place. The third day is the day when you can finally actually act. The third day is the day of resolution. It's a day of decision. I've experienced it. I've thought about it. And now here's what I'm going to do. That's the resolution. Now, on a human level, on a personal level, it really is a 3-day process. For some people, the day may be longer than 24 hours. especially if somebody's up all night in the hospital, that kind of thing. It could be longer than that, but typically it's 3 days. So let's take one example. Yonah, who's in this midrash. Yonah assumes he's going to die. That's what he thinks. Matter of fact, that's what he wants. It's pretty clear. And he has the sailors throw him off the boat. And very good point. He has the sailors throw him off the boat. He is assuming that he's going to die in the water. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, he gets swallowed by a fish, and he finds himself alive in a fish. I don't know how it works. I'm not a chassid of George Gershwin. It is necessarily so, okay? But he's alive. Thank you. I'm glad you got that. But it's a shock. What does he do on the third day? Not what happens to him. It's critical. What does he do on the third day?
He prays.
He prays. On the third day, he prays. And he prays not, what did you get me? And I wanted. He prays, please bring me back to your place. I want to come back and see your mikdash. So in other words, Yonah goes through the shock. He goes through a whole day of mulling it over, thinking it over. Third day is a day of resolution. What is the midrash saying about Avram? God comes to Avram and says, go take Yitzchak and offer him up. What a shock. Avram has got to be in a fog when he starts walking. He's in such a fog, he gets up early and saddles his own donkey. What does Rashi say? He's so impassioned to do what God says that he's not even thinking. He's an old man and he has certain servants to saddle up the donkey. He does it himself. He's not thinking straight. And God gives him time to walk. And finally, on the third day, Avram's ready to make a decision. And his decision is, I'm going to go through with it. And the rest of the world sees Avram had enough time. Esther is in shock because she has no idea what's happening. Read Megillat Esther. Esther in Perek Dalet has no idea there's a decree. She has no idea why her cousin is walking around in shabby clothes and torn clothes and sackcloth and ashes. Mordechai sends the message in, lets her know, okay. And finally, what's her reaction on that day? The day of shock? Fast for 3 days. By the way, that's an extreme reaction. Fast for 3 days. But she already, by the way, Esther is a brilliant, brilliant young woman. You got to remember that when the whole plot happens, she's no more than 18 years old because she's taken into the palace when she's 11 or 12. Right? So this is now 5 years have passed. So she's no more than 18 and she's got this whole thing figured out. And she understands we need 3 days. So she's in shock. And on the third day, she's ready to take that heroic step into the palace. And what the zchut that helps her out? The zchut that in our family, we have been able to deal with shock, mull it over, and on the third day, do the brave, difficult, confrontational thing. Avram doesn't run away with Yitzchak. And then we're going to get to Matan Torah. So that's what the third day is about. The same thing on a minor level. Yosef puts his brothers in prison for 3 days. What's Yosef trying to do? I mean, of course, there's that mode of thinking that Yosef's trying to take revenge on his brothers and angry at them and punish them. But he's trying to give them time to think about it. The first day they get thrown to prison, think about it. Today we arrived in Egypt. Today we see the viceroy of Egypt, the Safnat Paneach guy who's supposed to be a wizard and see through people. And he accuses us of being spies, so we know he's a fake. And he got thrown in prison. Yesterday we were on the road, and today I'm in prison. So good. And on the third day, you're ready to actually come to a decision about what's going to happen. That's the resolution. Notice the butler and baker's third day isn't here because that's not about them. They don't do anything. They just exist and then either live or die. But they don't act. 3 days happens. I want to show you one more example of the third day, which you wouldn't think of, I think, which I think also fits in. Let me just ask you the following. When a person becomes tameh, what do? A person becomes tameh because they touched a dead sheretz or a dead nevela, or a person becomes tameh because they had some tumah that came from their body, or a person becomes tameh because they sat on a chair that a mitzvah sat on. Person becomes tameh. How long are they tameh for? Two choices. I'm going to give you two choices, meaning there's two alternatives. How long are they tameh for?
They're sprinkled after 3 and after 7.
No, a person touched the dead sherets. Not a dead person or anything like that. A person touched the dead sherets. A person sat on the same chair that a Zav sat on. Some other kind of tumah. How long are you tameh for in halakha? The answer is there's two options. You're either tameh for that day, or you're tameh for 7 days.
You're talking about men, not women.
I'm talking about men or women, any human being, any Jew.
Well, women can be tameh for up to 66 days.
Right, and that's a different kind of tumah, because that's a tumah specifically with the world of kodshim, as opposed to tumah, let's say she can return to be with her husband after 2 weeks. And tumat yoledet may be in a separate category, but tumat yoledet is also 7 days plus 7 days, right? But classically tumah is, mitzvah also could be months before he gets healed. Okay, but tumah, let's make it simple. Any tumah that happened because you came in contact with something, not because something came out of you, not tumah yotzeit migufo, but tumah because you had contact, is either that day or 7 days. If I touch a dead animal, a carcass of a dead animal, it wasn't shechted properly, I'm tameh for that day. All right, so now let's say that I did it. I'm going to make this for Toronto time too. Let's say that I did it 10 hours ago. What time is it there? 9:30, right? So 10 hours ago was midday. Let's say I touch a dead veil at midday. What do? I go to the mikveh sometime before 5 o'clock, before the end of the day, before sunset, and I wait till the sun sets, and after it gets dark, I'm tahor again. I could be tameh for maybe an hour, maybe. That's 1 day. The other option is 7 days, right? I could be tameh for 7 days, and if I'm tameh for 7 days, that means that the first day, the day I became tameh is day 1. On the 7th day, I go to the mikveh during the day at some point, and that night I become tahor. Okay. But the bottom line is that when you're tameh, you only become tahor. You only go to the mikveh, on the last day. You only perform your ceremony of purification on the last day. That's always the case. There's one exception. Debbie, you mentioned it. What's the one exception?
Either it's sarat or it's a nazir.
Okay, well, it's right here in source 9, and it's tumat mate. Tumat mate. If you have contact with the dead, you touch the dead body, you were in a room with a mate, whatever it is, the halacha is that we take the paraduma, we burn the paraduma, we mix special kind of water in it, we throw in a hyssop and a cedar and a red string, and the whole thing is burned. I went out of order, but you have the whole mix, and then you go to the Kohen, any Kohen, on the 3rd day and the 7th day. On the 3rd day and the 7th day, and the Kohen sprinkles you with this mixture on the 3rd day, then you go back home, you're still tameh. You haven't accomplished anything. You're still tameh. But if you don't do that, you can't move forward. You come back on the 7th day and sprinkle again, go to the mikveh, that night you're tahor. Now, I understand the 7th day, because that's the last day of Tumah. Like any other Tumah, I go to the mikveh, so a special thing, besides the mikveh, I go to paraduma first. Paraduma, mikveh, boom. What's the 3rd day about? So I'd like to suggest the following. Tum'ah is a world unto itself. And how a person becomes tameh, how the body becomes tameh, how you generate tumah, how you contract tumah, if you will. It's harder to figure out than COVID. And nobody's figured out COVID yet. But one component of it is that tumat mate, contact with a dead body, from certain perspectives is seen as the most severe kind of tumah. From other perspectives is not. If you're tameh mate, you can go on to Har Bayit. That's why we go on Har Bayit today. That's why we're allowed to go. And if you're a Zav, for instance, you can't. But from another perspective, tumat mate is the most severe tumah. And what's it about? It's about a tremendous, deep-seated reverence for life that we have, and a recognition that any contact with death, even inadvertent, somehow lowers us. And we have to reflect on the nature of life and on the nature of death. So what happens? You're in a house with an elderly parent, perhaps, with a sick friend, and they pass away. The day they pass away is a day of shock. It's a day of shock. And by the way, even if they were sick for a long time, you were taking care of them, you were seeing to their meals, perhaps you were even taking care of cleaning them, and then everything changes in 1/2 second. I went through it. I'm sure many people here have gone through it. And everything changes. And instead of, can we ease her pain? Can we find a better way to feed her? How can we clean her better? Make her more comfortable? Should we sing to her? Instead of that, it's, okay, when's the next plane to Israel? It's a whole different mind, and it's a shock. And so there's a shock on the first day. And again, I don't care when the first day happens, if it's morning or night. That first day is the first day. And I'll show you that in Halakha. The second day is a day of thinking it over. And the third day is the day when you're actually ready to confront it. So the third day is the first time that you get mechatat on you. That's the first time that you go through any kind of semblance of a purification rituals on the third day. Then you have to wait for the seventh day because you're to wait for 7 days, etc. By the way, an avel, a mourner, on the day of death, if it is also the day of burial, which is our custom in Israel, we bury immediately, that person is exempt from tefillin. That avelut is considered to be avelut deoraita, Torah mandated mourning, as opposed to the rest of the week. The day of death, it has halachot in the Torah that affect a Kohen. Aharon could not eat korbanot on the day that his sons had died. And that was the big blow up between Aaron and Moshe. Aaron said, would it be good in God's eyes if as an onen I were to eat korbanot? I'm in shock. My sons just died. The first day is a day of shock. I like to pose the third day is the day of resolution. We're familiar with Shiva, but actually within the world of halakha, we're aware that there are nuances between the first day and the first 2 days and the rest of Shiva. Shlosha yamim lebechiyah, the first 3 days. And by the way, typically many of us don't. Now we do it by calling. We can't visit as much. I always wait till a couple days in. Give them a little time to accept it, to let it become a reality for them, and then talk with them. So I think that's why the Torah here mandates sprinkling the paradum water on the third day. There's all sorts of other examples. I'll give you one other example of how the 3 days seems to play out for this. And it's a very sour moment. But then we're going to get to Matan Torah, which is a great moment. In source 11, Rechavam, Shlomo's son, takes over. And he realizes that even though Yerushalayim is the capital, Yerushalayim is still not New York. Yerushalayim is still Albany. And so in order to be recognized, he goes to New York. New York is Shechem. Right? I don't know if I insulted there, but in any case, he goes to Shechem because he has to go to Shechem to be crowned because the tribes that he's most concerned with are Ephraim and Menashe, the powerful tribes of Yosef. That's who he has to contend with. He comes to Shechem and he wants to become their king. He wants them to accept him as the next king. And they say, listen, your father taxed the heck out of us. Lighten up the taxes and we'll be loyal to you. Watch what Rechavam says. It's odd. Vayomer Alehem, source 11. L'chu od shlosha yamim. Okay, give me 3 days to think about it. V'shuvu elai, and come back to me. V'yalchu ha'am. Now, by the way, whenever they say 3 days, they don't mean 3 days. They mean 2 days because Everything always happens on the third day. Happens in Matan Torah, happens with Esther, happens with Avram, and it happens here too. Go away for 3 days and let me think about it. And he consults with the elders who tell him to listen. He consults with his buddies who tell him not to listen. And like an idiot, he listens to his buddies. And from there on, the kingdom is split. And they come back on the third day. In other words, again, you've given me some news. I mean, the way it looks, what Rechavam is actually thinking about, I don't know. He didn't turn out to be such a great king, but the way it looks is Rechavam says, you've given me some shocking news. I didn't know that's how you felt about my father. I didn't know that's how you felt about the kingdom over you. So I need 3 days because today I have to be shocked. Tomorrow I have to mull it over, and the third day I'll have an answer for it. I come back, and then he gives a terrible answer, and Jewish history goes in a bad way. All right. So another example of this phenomenon in Tanakh. Now, I'd like to suggest one last thing before looking at our parasha. What is true about the individual is true about the collective. The individual goes through phases, the collective goes through phases. The individual experiences loss, the collective experiences loss. We're aware of that. But everything that every emotional experience that happens for the individual, that happens for the collective in a much slower way, because it's collecting lots of people. For the individual person, resolution comes on the third day. For the nation, it comes in the third month. Am Yisrael, let's keep this in mind, is in Egypt, has been told the whole time, Moshe is negotiating to give you a 3-day religious holiday. That's it, which means you're going to go for 3 days. And at the beginning of negotiations, you're going to go for 3 days, worship God, come back and go back to slavery. After a while, it seems to be you're going to go for 3 days, worship God and come back and not be slaves anymore. And then there's this shocking event, which is they hear screaming from every other house. In the meantime, they're eating Korban Pesach. The next morning, they find out that Paro, the king, came down to their village in the middle of the night and said, get out of Egypt. Go, take your animals, go, worship, to go. And the next morning, they walk out proudly. Imagine the shock. Imagine the shock of seeing the Egyptian army wash up on the shores of Yam Suf. It's all shock. And then there's a whole month of processing the shock. And by the way, in order to make that easier, water is provided for us through sticks and rocks, and food is provided to us every day. It's all taken care of so that we can just internalize what's happened. We're not slaves anymore. We're not in Egypt anymore. The Egyptian army is destroyed. It's a huge, huge thing. I will take you back 20 and a half years. Some of you may be in New York. If you were in New York on 9/11, around New York on 9/11, and you weren't right at ground zero, which would mean, of course, you were quite active in helping and running, whatever. What was your mood that day? I mean, I know I talked to lots of friends who lived there and watched it. Your mood that day was absolute shock. And the whole world was in shock. But in New York, it was shock. And it takes a few days just to internalize this is what's happened and how are we going to deal with it? And are we going to go round up everybody who's got a hijab on and kill them? Or are we going to try to make peace with the air? All this crazy thoughts. And then finally, after a while, we come to some sort of decision. Now, individuals go through a quicker process than the collective. That's the nature of things. And so finally, in the third month, we're ready to address HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But now we need the individual to come. So it's B'chodesh HaShlishi, the text points out, and that we arrive at Har Sinai ready to get the Torah. But what does Hashem say to Moshe? Watch what happens. Hashem calls Moshe up to the mountain, and he says what he says. Tell Bnei Israel, I want to make a brit with them. Let them know these are the terms. Let them know this is what they'll get if they keep the brit. Very good. Comes down, Bnei Israel says, yeah. Great. You know what yeah means? You know what it means? It means you haven't thought about it. It means you haven't thought about it. Because yeah means all you hear is the good stuff. You don't hear the responsibility. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't say, great, I got him where I want him. Here's the Torah. He doesn't say that. You know what he says? Take 3 days. And just to show you that the Torah is also about restraint, and the Torah is also about self-discipline, and the Torah is all not just, you're going to be a bunch of Mamlechet Kohanim. I want you to stay celibate for 3 days. Yes, there are halachic issues. Yes, etc. But there's also the psychological phenomenon of saying for 3 days, practice some self-restraint and experience what it actually means to come into a brit with me, because this brit, baby, is forever. This means for the rest of eternity, you and I are bound together in a brit. And it's a huge responsibility. Are you really ready for it? Yeah. Okay, take a couple days. 3 days. And what happens? On the third day, again, take 3 days. On the third day, it's not 3 days, it's 2+ days. On the third day, suddenly there's smoke, there's fire, there's lightning, there's shofar, the mountain is shaking, it's crazy. And what they said on the first day, which was Kol Asher Diber Adonai Na'aseh, we'll do everything God says. Now's the test. Now on the third day, you ready to do that? And they come and they approach the mountain. We're ready. And now they actually accept the Torah. And that's the emphasis. And that's why this darshan comes and says, blessed is God that gave this. And again, he's taking advantage of the fact that we've got Torah Nevi'im Tuvim. It's great. And Kohen Levi Yisrael. That's great. And that Moshe is the third from the womb. That's fine. He could also say, and a leader has 3 letters in his name. But on the third day in the third month, those are deliberate. Blessed is God who understood that his people, in order for them to actually make a commitment, need to go through the same process that we go through whenever shocking news is given to us. And the model for that is Abraham Avinu at the Akedah. And then the model for that as a nation is at Har Sinai. And that's why we have the 2 opinions. What was the zchut that stood for Esther, that on her third day, when she had resolved to come in and face the king, she had the strength to do it? It was either the personal strength that Abraham showed on the third day, or the personal strength that every member of Am Yisrael showed on the third day at Har Sinai. Which leaves us with somebody asked me, Rabbi Kelman, you asked me if Ali Yitzchak means Miriam, Aaron, and Moshe. Yeah. Oh, you mean through 3 people?
Yeah, I was just saying, okay, I figure you take it up when you're finished, but you mean the third born. I would assume it means by 3 people. Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam were the 3 people who were responsible for it.
So then it would have said Ayidei Tlata.
By 3 people as opposed to the third one. I'm not sure, maybe by the Aramaic grammar. Anyway, that's what I perhaps thought.
No, but the whole riff here is on third. It's on the ordinal third. Right.
Okay. I could be wrong.
But in any case, so the truth is I had a whole thing about Yitro to share with you, but we are at 50 minutes. You let me know. I can do Yitro in 10 minutes, or I can take questions.
Yeah.
Or we could say goodnight. It's Thursday night, and it's late where you guys are.
Yeah, we started a little late, but I mean, I'm willing to go if you'd like to. Listen, anybody can leave whenever they want, but if you'd like to do it in 8-9 minutes, we did start a little late. Sure, keep going. And those who want to stay, please, God, you'll stay. Okay?
Okay, good. Let's do some Yitro. Okay, so take a breath. And the reason I mentioned Cholent is because Cholent is, by the way, one of the biggest disruptors to proper Torah study. You wonder how I could say such a thing. So it's because you think about it, you hear the Kriyat Torah on Shabbat, in the end of the Parsha, and you learn what you learn, then you go home, you have Cholent, you take a nap, you wake up, you hear the next thing, and you never connect them. And often there's a connection between the end of one Parsha and the beginning of the next, such as at the end of Yitro, the beginning of Mishpatim, important connection. And we don't make it because we had Cholent. So this is not a Cholent problem because Yitro and Matan Torah are all in Parshat Yitro, and we're going to hear them all in Shabbat, so we're okay here. All right. Okay. Who is Yitro? So I want to show you the following problem. Let me start with this premise. Does the Torah know how to tell us that somebody has 2 names? Does the Torah know how to
Choten
tell us
Moshe.
what?
Yitro is Choten Moshe.
That's his relationship, but not a name. Does the Torah know how to tell us when an individual has two names? Yes, it does. Avram, you're no longer Avram, you're Avraham. Sarai is no longer Sarai, she's Sarah. Yaakov, your name's going to be changed to Israel twice, and you keep getting called both by both names, right? Hosea becomes Yehoshua. Yosef becomes Tzafnat Paneach, and I'm boring you. But the Torah tells us when somebody has two names. Now we meet three people in the context of Tzipporah's family by name, and the question is, who are they? So I want to start with the end, and that is in Parshat Bahalotcha. Moshe, as they're leaving Har Sinai, comes up to somebody named Chovav ben Ruel. It's here in source 1. Vayomer Moshe leChovav ben Ruel Amidyani, Choten Moshe. Now, this guy's called Choten Moshe, which means what? What does that mean, Choten Moshe?
His father-in-law.
Father-in-law. And since he's Ben Ruel Amidyani, we know it's that same father-in-law from Tzipporah, etc. So Tzipporah's father, his name is Chovav. Okay, and what does he say to him? By the way, what's he not called here? So keep that in mind. And he says, basically, we're traveling, please come with us. We want you to share in. And he says, no, I want to go back to my land. And he says, no, please don't leave us. You know we're at a camp in the desert. Please lead us in the desert. Does he come with him? In the end, he actually does come. We know that because we see it later on in Shoftim, that Chovav's descendants are in Eretz Israel. Okay. But now let's see who this guy is, Chovav ben Ruel. You take a look at the first introduction. Moshe runs away from Egypt. He runs to Midian, and we find him at the well. The Kohen Midian, who, by the way, is not just a religious leader, he's also a political leader, as we see, because Yitro, who's Kohen Midian, gives Moshe political advice, governing advice. Kohen Midian has 7 daughters. They come to get water. The other shepherds chase them away. Vatavona el Ruel avihen. So now, Kohen Midian has 7 daughters, and they come to Ruel, their father, which means who's Kohen Midian? Ruel. That's pretty straightforward. And he says, why do you leave a man out there? Bring him in. Moshe stays with him. He gives Tzipporah, which means Tzipporah Vito is one of those 7 girls who was out getting water, is Tzipporah. And Tzipporah marries Moshe, which means Ruel is Moshe's father-in-law, and Tzipporah is Moshe's wife. And that's pretty straightforward. Okay, and that's all we hear. Now, you move ahead to Perek Gimel, right before the Sneh. How does the Sneh scene start? Try saying that a few times, Sneh scene. Moshe haya roet son Yitro chotno Kohen Midian. Moshe is working as a shepherd for whom?
His
Who do you work-
father-in-law.
Father-in-law. His father-in-law, who you say is Ruel, but here he's called Yitro. And by the way, he's Kohen Midian, so that fits. Okay, very good. Which means we got to now say Yitro and Ruel are the same guy. But why didn't the Torah say Yitro who Ruel, like Yerubal who Gidon, or Yedidah who Shlomo? It sort of says that, right? Why didn't it say that? And by the way, Yitro is called Yeter here in Pasuk 6. Yeter, Yitro, that's all the same thing. All right, and by the way, in our Parsha, Yitro shows up, and it's Yitro, Chotno, Kohen, Midian, over and over and over. So who is this? So I'm going to ask you one simple question, which is going to break the whole logjam. But let's take a look, before asking the question, look at the conversation with Chovav, who we don't meet besides here in the Torah. What is Yitro called consistently besides Chotno?
He's the head of Midian. That
Kohen
comes
Midian.
first and foremost.
Kohen Midian.
That's always first before anything else.
Right, Kohen Midian. What's Chovav called here? You're right, nothing. Chovav is not called Kohen Midian. He's called Midiani because he's a Midiani. That's it. Okay. So I'm going to ask you, what is a choten? So chotain, if you think about it, means somebody who's related by marriage. That's what it means. A chotain is somebody related by marriage. And here the Ibn Ezra, you see in source 2, in Bamidbar says, Derech hamikra likro aviha na'ara ve'acheha chotain. In the Torah, in the Tanakh, the word chotain means father-in-law or brother-in-law. Now let's go through the whole passage and see what's going on. Moshe speaks to Chovav, who is Ben Ruel Hamidyani, Choten Moshe. By the way, who's Choten Moshe in this pasuk? Ruel, father-in-law. Okay, then who's Chovav? Who's Chovav? It's Chovav Ben Ruel, and Ruel is Moshe's father-in-law. Who's Chovav?
Brother-in-law?
Brother-in-law. Let me ask you a question. Why is Ruel letting his daughters go out and have trouble with the shepherds if there's a son? By the way, you asked the same question about Lavan and Rachel. And the same answer, by the way, is the sons came along later. Chovav's younger. He wasn't born yet, or he wasn't old enough yet to be shepherding, so he sent the daughters out. Now, the real question is, who's Yitro? So this all hinges on one other question. When did Moshe get to Midian? When did Moshe get to Midian? When he ran away from Egypt. So the Ramban claims that when Moshe ran away from Egypt, which was when he killed the Egyptian, he was a kid. He was a teenager. He was hot-headed. When we meet Moshe at the Sneh, he's 80. So where is he during that time? So there's Midrashim about going to Kush and fighting wars and marrying the Kushi woman. Also Midrashim. Simple read is that he ended up in Midian pretty soon, and he spent a lot of time in Midian, which means he meets Tzipporah. Ruel is the aging father who's the Kohen Midian. By the way, what's happened in the meantime? Ruel died. Who took over? Another son by the name of Yitro. So now take a look at Pasuk Gimel, Shmot Gimel Aleph in source 5. Moshe Yaro et son Yitro Chotno. Chotno meaning brother-in-law, Kohen Midian. Why isn't Yitro shepherding? Because he's Kohen Midian. You can't ask the Kohen Midian to shepherd. He's busy running the tribe, and he's a religious guy. By the way, Moshe has another brother-in-law, the younger brother of Yitro and of Tzipporah, whose name is Chovav. He's not Kohen Midian. Notice, by the way, what Moshe does not ever ask Yitro to do. He never asks Yitro, please come with us. He can't. Yitro's in charge of Midian. But who does he ask to come with us? Chovav. Because Chovav's not in charge of Midian. Chovav's Mishpacha. Come with us. And Chovav does in the end. How do I know Chovav does? Because in the story that we read last Shabbat, as the Haftarah, we hear about Chever HaKeni, that by the way is Yael's husband, Nifrad Mikayin, he left the regular group of Kenim, Mibnei Chovav Chotein Moshe, which means Chovav came with Bnei Israel. Look at the beginning of Shoftim, you'll see it. His children lived there among Bnei Israel. They were friendly allies to Bnei Israel. Take a look in Shmuel Aleph Perek Tet Vav at the beginning of the Amalek story, which we're going to hear next in 2 weeks at the Haftarah. And so Chovav did come with him, because Chovav could. You suddenly see here that some of the mysteries about who this guy is actually is quite clear once we just take a look at this one line of the Ibn Ezra. We could read the story through again and get a whole new picture of who we're talking about. Moshe meets, when he's young, he meets the family and he meets the aging Kohen Midian and marries his daughter, Tzipporah. And that aging Kohen has 2 sons at least, one named Yitro and one named Chovav. Yitro is the one fit to take over. He takes over. And Chovav is a regular guy, and Moshe asks him to come along, and he ends up doing that. So a little clarification there about who's who in the Parsha. And hopefully everybody have a great Shabbat. Stay healthy, stay warm. I'm embarrassed to say that I took a walk this afternoon in short sleeves here in LA, but in any case, enjoy the winter and have a great Shabbat.
Thank you very much. That was a very original interpretation. I don't know that any of the Mefarshim actually, I say that, right?
Well, the Ibn Ezra does actually.
That what Chovav is Yitro. Yitro and Chovav are the brother-in-laws of Moshe.
Right.
It's generally assumed by the Mefarshim Yitro is the father-in-law.
Right, but you see the problem. And the
Right? No,
biggest
I
problem
understand. I
the
understand.
biggest problem is, why doesn't the Torah just say Yitro, who rule well, if they wants to give the two names?
All right. And any questions, by the way? I don't want to, let's take a look at the chat box. I don't really think if anybody wants to ask any questions, Bavakasha.
Right, so Audrey, are you still there, Audrey? Audrey put in a note here pointing out exactly that at the end of the story, Moshe sends Yitro back because Yitro can't stay with them. Right, exactly. Very good. I see a lot of friends on here, so hello to everybody. Stay healthy, and it's good to see you on, if nothing else, see your names on the chat. And good. Oh, good. So somebody asked, how was Yitro able to give governing advice? So that's what I mentioned, is that Kohen Midyan doesn't just mean like a religious officiant. You have to, let's see, who are the Midyanim? The Midyanim themselves are a bunch of different Bedouin tribes. They're not one group. They're a bunch of different Bedouin tribes. We find them in the North Sinai, we find them in the Arabian Peninsula, and we find them on the east bank of the Jordan. So there are a lot of different places. And if you think about it, Moshe now has a huge Bedouin tribe that he's got to deal with. We're a bunch of travelers. We're nomads. We don't have a place. And we're living in tents. And so Yitro has his own experience, and maybe he learned it from his father, about how to deal with being one person who leads this huge group. Now, his group wasn't nearly as big as ours, but they were big, as you could see in the war with the Midyanim. The Midyanim are big people, right? So hopefully that answers the question. Okay, so Ilana asked the question, why do the Midrashim go so far as to explain that Yitro has 7 names? This is a classic Midrashic piece, which is its own area of study and is deep and speaks to some essential truths that Chazal see in the Mikra when they identify Hagar and Keturah as the same person, Yiska and Sarai is the same person, when they identify Memuchan and Haman as the same person, when they say Pinchas ze Eliyahu, when they say that the two Ne'arim are Kalev and Pinchas, all sorts of places where the Midrashim take either two separate people and turn them into one, and perhaps the most extreme example is where Chazal say, it's in Masachet Rosh Hashanah Daf Gimel, that Koresh, Daryavesh, and Artaxshast are all the same person, making our study of history of the Persian Empire impossible. What do Chazal mean by that? So I'll just give you a very, very short idea that I heard once from my teacher of Yoel Ben Nun, that when Chazal identify two people as being the same, when it's clear that they're two different people because one dies and the other one shows up, that kind of thing, what it means is that the characteristics or motivation of them is alike. And if you want to understand one, look at the other. And a great example of that is, if you look carefully at Memuchan's brilliance, manipulative brilliance in Perek Aleph of Megillat Esther, you can understand how Haman was successful in rising to power if you say Memuchan ze Haman. Right? So in other words, if we take these Midrashim literally as saying Hagar and Keturah are the same person, we end up with something fairly bizarre, because it means that Hagar, at the age of 90, is suddenly giving birth to 20 kids, or however many. Right? Remember, Hagar gave birth when Avram was 86. And now it's at least 50 years later, actually close to 60 years later. And this is Hagar now having all these kids. Right? So we have to distinguish between what the Midrashim are saying and try to figure out why the Midrashim are saying that and what's Pshat. Pshat in the story of Avram finding a wife for Yitzchak is that the slave is some guy whose name we don't know. It's very difficult in Pshat to say that slave is the same Eliezer that we met back in Lech Lecha. However, Chazal say it's Eliezer, and they have a reason for saying that. And to understand it, we have to start with the premise that the Chet in Chazal stands for Chachamenu. They're really wise, they're really brilliant, and they're telling us something much deeper than just a surface identification. Hopefully that helps. Oh, good. So Jennifer asked a question. about whether Yitro was dark-skinned and the whole thing about the Kushite. What is the story with the Kushite? Is that Tzipora, or is that another woman? That's the whole midrashic development of Moshe running away to Cush and marrying a Cushite princess and then abandoning her. And what was it that Miriam? There's a big machloket rishonim on the parsha in the beginning and at the end of Balotcha about what Miriam was complaining about. Was it about Tzipora or was it about some other woman? So it's unclear. In any case, thanks for your questions. Thanks for your involvement. And it's great to see some familiar faces. And thank you, Rabbi Kelman, for the last minute invite.